Hi, good afternoon and aloha. My name is Jürgen Steinmetz. I'm from livestream.com and livestream.travel in Honolulu. And with me is Paul Hudson. He's joining us from Washington, D.C. And Paul is a very known figure in the aviation industry. He's running an organization, Flyersrights, and he will tell you a little bit more about it. Paul, welcome. What is Flyersrights?
Thank you for having me. Yes, I'm glad to be here, Jorgen. It's a strange world we live in, and it's gotten stranger for air travelers, especially by the month. We've never seen anything like this. So, Flyersrights is, as you probably know, is the largest airline passenger organization, and we're based in Washington, D.C. We have about 60,000 members right now. And we basically do three things. We provide a hotline, which is Flyers 877-FLYERS-6 for people that have particular problems with air travel. We also do advocacy on behalf of airline passengers, primarily before the U.S. federal government on both safety and consumer issues. And we also provide lots of general information on our website, flyersrights.org, and on our Twitter feed and on Facebook.
So you're an advocate for consumers, for travelers, is that correct?
Yes, particularly for airline passengers. And we're working on this issue of COVID health safety as one of our #1 issues right now. As everyone knows, air travel almost completely shut down back in March and April. And it's just now getting to the point where it's still less than half of what it was. So we have filed petitions, rulemaking petitions with the Department of Transportation to mandate that you have masks like this at airports and on planes. As everyone knows, this is recommended now by virtually all medical science. It's required supposedly by airlines, and most of them do require you put the mask on when you go on the plane. But once the flight takes off, there's very little enforcement. And in fact, without a federal rule, it's strictly voluntary. And a few airlines have even told their flight attendants not to really enforce the masking. And so we know that COVID spreads very easily through air travel. And that when it started out, coming out of China, it was spread almost entirely by air travel. That is, people who were tested or were infected would go from China to Europe, to the United States, really to many countries in the world. And because of the delay in getting symptoms, they would often not even know they had it, and they would be spreading it not just to other passengers, but to other people in the destinations. We tried back in April to get testing for passengers and for crew before they could go on the flight. But it's now many months later, and that still hasn't happened. So in August, we filed what's called an emergency rulemaking petition to mandate that all airlines and airports are required to have the people masked if they can't be socially distant. And that's where we were back in August. As of last Friday, ironically, the same time that the president was being transported to the hospital with COVID, the DOT in their wisdom denied our petition and said they want to remain giving just guidance and have masking on airplanes still be voluntary.
That is almost an unbelievable decision. I just don't know what triggered this. What do you think is the reasoning behind it?
It's really a situation of ideology, to use a pun, trumping over not just medical science, but common sense. And even a lot of airline executives and the International Air Transport Association that represents the airlines worldwide has called for national governments in order to control the COVID to require masks.
It's, I mean, I'm literally, when I saw your note, and I know we published it at eTurbo News, I was kind of speechless because I thought this was a given. And even working with this issue on a daily basis, I was not aware this wasn't already a regulation. We're getting a lot of the press releases, like United Airlines is one of them, I recall, American Airlines another, Hawaiian Airlines, and several others that are saying, in order to get on our flights, you have to wear a mask, and we're enforcing it. Do you know what airlines are not enforcing it?
Well, some of the ultra low cost airlines, we've gotten reports about Spirit and Allegiant, for instance, and Frontier, as they're not really enforcing it. But getting on the plane with this is one thing. But once you're on the plane, there's really nothing that happens except first people do this, and then they do this.
Right.
And on a longer flight of, over 3 hours, for instance, very few people, in my observation, were really having their masks up all the way. I recently flew in early September on Delta on a 6-hour flight and a couple of 2.5, 3-hour flights. And that was the situation. And not to excuse any of this lack of enforcement by airlines, but you have to remember that without a federal regulation, they are in a position where they cannot easily enforce keeping your mask on. If you violate a regulation, for instance, say you don't want to wear a seatbelt, there are penalties involved with that. There are fines and other things, but there's nothing with regard to not wearing a mask.
That is such. That is probably equally important than wearing a seatbelt, almost in today's age. Are there, to your knowledge, any statistics in regards to flight crew getting infected on airlines with mask wearing policies and enforcement and without? Are there any studies you're aware of?
Well, we know there's between scores and hundreds of pilots and flight attendants that have gotten COVID. And because they're not tested, at least it's not required that they be tested, they have probably infected others.
Right.
And there's been a few deaths. We also have, another provision, which is only common sense. Now that we have tests that are very rapid, like 15 minutes, there's no reason why there shouldn't be a regulation saying whether you're a pilot or a flight attendant or a passenger, that you shouldn't be tested before you get on a flight, especially for long haul flights, where published studies have shown that that's the biggest danger.
I mean, like here in Hawaii, our state has been closed for tourism more or less since March, but you were allowed to fly here. But once you get here, you have to observe a 2-week mandatory quarantine. And for tourists, that means staying in your hotel room. In the first part, this was not really enforced. Now, I understand in Honolulu alone, there are 160 special agent police officers enforcing it and going down hallways in hotels and checking on people if they're really in their rooms. Now, this will all change on October 15th, when we actually allow visitors from the US mainland first, not international visitors, but from the US mainland to come in here with a COVID test that is no older than 72 hours. And some airlines like United is offering these tests through the mail. And they also offer in San Francisco only as a pilot project, an instant test. You can get an hour or so before your departure. Now, how is this on the US mainland to the best of your knowledge? Are there similar regulations or are we very special here in Hawaii with putting this in place?
No, you're very special. There are a few questions they ask you. Have you traveled outside the United States? Have you had a fever? Have you tested positive for COVID? But they're just 3 or 4 yes or no questions, and there's no proof. There's no actual testing required.
Wow. I did not know that because I have to admit on my end, I'm a very frequent flyer. I'm a 3 million mile flyer with United. I've been traveling constantly, but I haven't left this island since March. So flying for many people like me, I think is going to be a new experience altogether. And we have to see how this is, but the very minimum you would expect from an airline and from a country is to make sure people are safe or as safe as it can get when stepping on an aircraft. Do you see this type of regulation will become a rule soon with your intervention, or do you think we're going to have to wait till after the election, or how do you predict this would move forward?
Well, I don't like predictions because I'm usually wrong. I have a hope that the U.S. will come around. I see even the president is now wearing masks more completely regularly, and apparently he's required to, considering his situation. But I think we'll know in the next week whether they're going to actually require masks for U.S. Airlines. And a lot of it depends on the public reaction. You know, back in March, the airlines thought they would get a big hit to their traffic, but no one predicted it would go down by 95%.
Right.
And that's what happened. And so ultimately, it's the passenger that will decide this. If they don't fly, the airlines will not be able to fly, and many of them will be bankrupt. And I suspect if you call your congressman, if you call your senator, you tell them we got to have masking mandatory on planes, that could actually help.
And that's so important to do, and I would encourage everyone to do so. And it is really a very unfortunate situation. The aviation industry is struggling. And when you look at other airlines overseas, like Emirates or Etihad, for example, Qatar Airways, guys in the Gulf region already had instant tests in place months and months ago. I remember when Emirates finally decided to get back into business, and this must have been like 2-3 months ago, they required tests instantly at the airport. So literally a few minutes before you take off and get on the plane, you better be tested. I understand these tests only have about a 65 or 68% accuracy rate, but it's still better than nothing. I would think. And yes, call your congressman and tell the airlines you wouldn't fly unless this is a requirement that is also enforced. This is very interesting information. And I know, Paul, you're not only an advocate for the consumer rights, but you're also an attorney. And asking you as an attorney, don't you think if a passenger, God forbid, gets sick on an aircraft because of COVID and can prove that the airline did not enforce the mask policy, would that put the airline possibly up into a legal liability?
It could, but it would be a very difficult matter of proof. And I haven't seen this yet with airlines, but a lot of people, or rather businesses involved with tourism, require people to sign waivers.
Really? Okay, so you sign a waiver of telling the airlines you're they're not responsible no matter what happens, basically.
Yeah, and so that's very difficult. Yes, you know, there have been situations that are like that, but they're far and few between. We have also no regulations with regarding to cleaning, and that's another issue.
Wow.
At first, it was thought that surfaces would harbor the virus, and that was the main way to transport it. But we now know that it's mainly through the air, and airlines have been advertising they have these HEPA filters, and that's supposed to take care of things. But the other way it's transmitted is not just through droplets that fall down after 6 feet or so, but aerosols, which are very fine particles. And the recent studies that I've read that are published indicate that there were instances where on long-haul flights, one person was infected and he managed to infect 15 others on a long-distance flight because of aerosol transmission. And so the testing before you get on the plane, the masking when you're on the plane are really essential. It's not possible to have a 6 foot or longer social distance in most aircraft. When I flew recently, I was surrounded on 3 and 4 sides within 2.5 feet with other people. Someone in front of you, someone behind you, and even if you keep the middle seat vacant, someone on the other side. And unless you were to reduce the capacity of airplanes by 2/3 to 3/4, you will not get social distancing. And even that is perhaps not as effective as people thought when you're talking about an enclosed space on long distance flights.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is definitely a place, no matter how hard you try, unless you go on a private passenger jet and or you fly maybe one of these apartment residence class on Etihad Airways from New York to Abu Dhabi, where you have a whole suite of a living room, a bedroom, and even a jacuzzi on an aircraft. You cannot do social distancing. I agree with you. Paul, this was a very interesting session. I would love to talk to you more in the future. I know you're right on the pulse when it comes to the aviation industry and now COVID. This must be a big challenge really for you to be an advocate, at the same time also see the needs of the industry to reopen and advise everyone accordingly. Really appreciate you being here, and hopefully we can have you back very soon.
Thank you very much.